Hello, psychology students. So this is our first video of our psychology or our social psychology unit. As we've already discussed in class, this unit basically is made up of understanding all the different pieces of our 5 A words and then our social influences and group dynamics. This video is going to focus in just on those first 2 A words of attribution and attitude. So we're really going to look at what are these concepts, what is attribution, what is attitude, what makes them happen, why are we having the attributions and attitudes that we do, and then what mistakes do we make when we are engaging in the process of attribution and in the attitudes that we hold. And so as we get into this, we're going to start with just the basic understanding of what is attribution. And so one of the things that we know about people is we're primed to be able to read each other. We are primed to be able to really focus on interactions that we're having with others and watching the interactions that other people are having, even if they don't include us. And that leads us to attribution. So, attribution is when we are explaining the causes of a behavior. And so that can include our own. So anytime we find ourselves explaining why a person is doing what they're doing, we're making an attribution. And once again, that can be myself. I can tell you why I'm engaging in a certain behavior as well, and that still counts as an attribution. So this really helps us to be able to explain what's going on in our world. It helps us understand what's going on in our world, and it helps us plan for our future. If we are seeing a certain behavior that either ourselves or someone is engaging in a certain situation, that can be very beneficial to let us see what can we expect in the future from that person. So attributions can be internal or external. And generally, when we talk about an internal attribution, we are talking about one of the core characteristics of that person. So that could be like their personality, whereas we have external attributions, which are attributing the behavior to some sort of unique situation that they are in. And so as we are going through, let's just make a quick hypothetical example of someone borrows your notebook for a night. You needed to catch up on notes. They took it home and you told them, hey, I need this back tomorrow. So they agree. They say they're going to bring it back the next day. The next morning, you see them in the halls. They rush by you and you ask for the notebook and they just say, sorry, I don't have it. And then they leave and they're in class and you don't talk anymore to them. So what kind of attributions are you making there? And generally, it's going to fall into one of two things. So you're either going to make an internal attribution. Wow, I loaned that person my notebook. They're such a jerk. They're lazy. They're irresponsible. They're inconsiderate because they told me they were going to bring that and they didn't. So that clearly there's a problem with them. So in that case, you're making an internal attribution. Or maybe you are being a little more on the considerate side, knowing that that's not normal for that person. So then you start to think, oh, maybe the alarm clock didn't go off and they got here really late and they forgot to grab it. Maybe they had a family crisis that kept them up until 3 a.m. the night before. And so that distracted them from the importance of the notebook. And so those would be examples of external attributions. And so they can be balances of both, or they can really be dominant one way or another. If we look at the example on the screen, we have Joe watching Bob hitting Steve. And so I'd like you to think for a second, what would an internal attribution be? If we're trying to explain Bob's behavior of hitting Steve, what would an internal attribution look like? What would an external attribution look like? As you're thinking internal, you want to be considering something that Bob is doing that is the core to who he is. So maybe Bob is just a mean-hearted person and he goes around and hits people because he's a bully. And we can see how we're attributing this and we're saying this is clearly who Bob is. And so if we see someone hitting someone else and we make an internal attribution, that's generally going to be negative. But did we consider external? What if Bob is not a mean person? What if Bob is not a bully? What if, I don't know, we can say any sort of external. Maybe Steve said, hey, I have this bee on my head and it's really scaring me. And Bob is trying to crush the bee without stinging him. I don't know. Finding some sort of external way to explain this. So that has nothing to do with the core personality of who Bob is. That's just saying, hey, we have this outside influence that's making Bob do this in this particular scenario. So as we start to look at why do we make these attributions in the way that we do? And so when we do this, let's just give an example from a teacher point of view. So let's say that you as the student are always misbehaving in class, and you're let your imagination take that as far as you want to, but you're the troublemaker in class and I need to make an attribution about you. So is that going to be internal or external? Is it something that's influencing you in the presence of my class, or is it something that is a core to who you are? And so we look at the ways that we evaluate the scenario, and we're doing this we're not always like processing through and thinking through this in this way, but yet our minds are great at thinking through these things. And so we look at consistency, and distinctiveness in terms of why we make them. So the consensus is, how are other people's behavior similar to the behavior of the person that I'm judging? So if I look at you and I say, you are always misbehaving in my class, the consensus angle is going to say, well, is everybody else in the class also misbehaving? And then we can start to say, well, now we can judge internal and external. If everyone walks into my class and they're all misbehaving, clearly there's an external influence here, because that's not anything internal. That's something about the environment that's allowing people to behave that way. However, if everyone else in class does everything they're supposed to and you aren't, maybe there's an internal. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not an external influence on you, but from the outside looking in, we're more easy to judge that as an internal because you are not doing what everybody else is doing. So the next thing we might do is consistency. So this is, how similar is this behavior across time and situations? So are you the disruptive student in every class? So if I talk to all of your other teachers, they say, yes, they always behave this way. Well, again, that would imply that maybe I should be considering an internal attribution for you. But again, if we find out that in all of your other classes, you're perfect, you come to mine, you cause issues. Well, then once again, we say, well, clearly that's not an internal characteristic because you're different here. And so we look at the consensus, the consistency, and lastly, the distinctiveness. So does this particular set of behaviors or this particular response stand out in relation to similar situations? So are you, if we just look within the context of my own class, are you always good? And then today you're just having a really bad day, in which case today is distinct. That shows us there's some sort of external influence on your behavior. Or are you like this every single day, in which case this behavior is not really distinct? So we use these things and then we can make our attributions. The problem is sometimes we make mistakes about this. Think about the last time you made a decision, you made an attribution about a person that you don't know. And we do it all the time. So you're walking out and someone, like, let's say you're in a parking lot, for example, and someone drives up and takes the parking spot while you were sitting there with your turn signal. Think about what your initial thoughts are about that person. Or even if we go out into beyond a parking lot and we say you're just on the road, someone makes clearly a dangerous or illegal move. What do you think about that person? And generally, people are going to automatically go towards those internal judgments. So that person is such an inconsiderate jerk. You're going to go into name calling mode. And that you're now making an internal attribution on this person that you don't know. The fundamental attribution error is when we ignore those external influences. So if we're ignoring the external influences and now attributing behavior to something internal, we're making a mistake, because a lot of these bad behaviors that we're willing to just dump on someone and say, well, they're being rude, Maybe there's something going on. Maybe they're in a crisis and therefore they're having to run to the emergency room to a hospital. And so if you're trying to get to the emergency room because someone's life is on the line, I'm not going to worry as much about if that behavior might be perceived as rude, because right now we're in a life or death situation. But that could be ignored in a fundamental attribution error. And so that error is that we're not considering those external influences that could be making losing my train of thought, that could be also influencing that behavior instead of just the internal one. And the actor observer bias is very similar, except in the actor observer bias, we are just making ourselves the actor in this case. So if I was in that situation, if I was acting in that situation, I would behave differently than this person that I'm watching happen. So again, it's an example of the fundamental attribution error, because as we're watching someone else engage in a behavior, we're not fully considering all the different external influences on that behavior. But yet we're still making a judgment that says, if I was in that situation, I would be doing something different. And a lot of times in the midst of all this also links up to our self-serving bias, where we are making judgments that often serve ourselves. It allows us to protect ourselves and think better of ourselves. So maybe I took a test, I failed the test. So the self-serving bias is going to come up with some reason why it's not my fault, something to preserve my sense of self-worth. Maybe that teacher is unfair. Maybe that I didn't study last night because my boss made me work an extra shift. Whatever it is, that it becomes the way that you start to think about things. And then that will also start to influence your future behaviors as well, based on how you explain things in relation to what is internal to you and what's external to you. So then we go on to our other A word of attitude. So attitude is one of the most widely studied psychology concepts. And so this is basically just the way we respond to certain people or objects or events that are based on our own predispositions. So what we need to consider is this is not the common usage of attitude. So if we start to talk about attitude, we see things like this quote on the screen of attitude's everything, or attitude's everything in life, 10% of what you make of it, and 90% of how you take it. Like there's pieces of that that's correct. A lot of times we consider attitude towards like a life perspective, or even like if I respond to you in a certain way, you might say that I had attitude. And that's not what we're talking about here. Here we are talking about the way you respond to certain things. And that, again, within the way I'm responding in a certain situation can qualify, but it narrows it too much. This is your attitude towards anything. So if I said, what's your attitude towards ice cream? What's your attitude towards a bee? We could throw anything out there and you will have some sort of response to it. So when we look at this, we have our 3 components to attitude. And when we ask you about attitude, we want you to consider all 3. So we have the cognitive component, and we know anytime we say cognitive, we're talking about what you think. So this is your set of beliefs about whatever that target object is. You have your behavioral components. How do you act towards that target object? And then affective component. If you're not familiar with affective, that's referring to emotional, your feelings. And so we will see that a lot in this course. So it is important. Start letting that burn into your brain, that affective refers to feelings and emotions. So what is the feeling about that object? So as we can start to look at this, we can say something like, what is your attitude towards ice cream? So you're going to have your initial thing like, what do you think about ice cream? So maybe you think ice cream is good. Ice cream is great for a summer day. What about the behavior component? What do you behave like in the presence of ice cream? And so a lot of people would say, well, I'm going to eat it. I'm going to scoop some out and I'm going to eat some of it. Now that's your behavioral component. And then your feelings. So if you have feelings towards ice cream, does ice cream elicit a positive response from you? Does it elicit a negative response? And so I'm intentionally choosing something like ice cream because it's not something that we necessarily have a negative attitude towards. But everything in life we have attitude towards. So let's look at where our attitudes come from. So when we have an attitude, some of the most easy ones to consider are our social influences. So social influences, of course, can be your peers, it can be your parents, it can be your interactions with pretty much anybody else. So think about, again, how those different components, the cognitive, the behavioral, and the affective, could all be influenced socially. So I like to think about how within my own parenting, I try to create certain attitudes towards things. And the one that sticks out because it's been recent is, let's talk about bugs. We need to make a distinction between bugs. So as you're playing in the swimming pool and you see a wasp, what do you think about that wasp? And now what you have is you're looking around. The first time you encounter some of these bugs, you don't have any idea what to think about them. And so as you look and you say, oh, well, there's a bug. What kind of bug is that? Someone's going to tell you, oh, that's a wasp. Wasps can sting you. And now you have a thought, oh no, wasps can sting. So how are you going to behave differently? Maybe if you're in the case of like my daughter, you're now going to be actively separating yourself. You're going to leave the situation where the wasp is, go somewhere else, and that's your behavior. And you're doing so because of the affective component, because you're scared now. You're scared of this bug that might sting you. On the other hand, we have bugs like lightning bugs. So we go around and, oh no, there's another bug. It's dark colored, it flies. Is that a wasp too? And now, oh no, let's use the social influence and teach you differently about this one and how this one is okay. This one just lights up instead of stings you. And so a lot of times as you get these social influences, they're coming with a value judgment that helps influence what you're now going to behave and think and feel. It can also come through conditioning. And so conditioning is basically when, through the behaviors process that we haven't really discussed in class yet, but as you become in the presence of a certain stimulus, from that, you're going to get some sort of reaction from the environment. And so that conditioning can then teach you. So maybe you never knew anything about a wasp, but then all of a sudden the wasp comes up and stings you. Now, all of a sudden, you're getting punished for it. And now you're going to have a negative attitude towards wasp just because the wasp has now conditioned you to do so. We can also, of course, reinforce certain behaviors. So if you win your sports event and we take you out for ice cream, now we've conditioned you to, one, you have a positive attitude towards winning, and that connects to ice cream, which you already have positive influences for, and we're making associations between those things. The last element here is the mere exposure effect, and this is one of several social psychology concepts where we will be discussing the work of Robert Zients. So we'll talk more about some of his actual research later on. But you do need to know his name because he's a very influential social psychologist. So the mere exposure effect is basically this concept that your attitudes towards people or objects become more positive the more times you are exposed to it. Hence, the effect of exposing you, just the mere exposure gives you a more positive attitude. And so this is one of the core elements in advertising. And so that's what these images are here on the screen to remind us of. So if we have recently seen the Scott Trade Center turn to the Enterprise Center. And so, you know, if you go watch a hockey game, you aren't going to be renting a car from Enterprise necessarily in that point. But what they're wanting from you is to expose you to that brand name a lot. And if they can expose you to that brand name a lot, what you're going to have happen is you now have a slightly more positive attitude towards Enterprise than some of the other ones. You don't really know why, but what we know is you've been exposed to it more. This is the driving force behind a lot of advertisements where you're not quite sure what that is trying to show you, other than it's just an image of a brand name. And so I brought up the NASCAR examples here too. Tide, the laundry detergent, isn't really something you affiliate with sports car racing, really, nor is Lowe's as the home improvement warehouse. So, but what they're trying to do is that you stare at this and you stare at this, and maybe you even have a positive attitude with something related to it. But really, the point is, we just want to expose you to this a lot so that you now have a more positive attitude the more exposed you have. And these are really, especially the mere exposure effect, are more where the attitude is initially coming from, because if you're unfamiliar with it, it's going to become positive. Um, the mere exposure effect is not really going to be effective for changing an attitude once it's formed. If you've already decided that you hate Tide laundry detergent, seeing it for an entire length of a car race is not going to change your attitude. But if you're neutral towards it, we might find you more positively have a more positive attitude towards Tide than you would have otherwise. All right, so we can also look at how attitudes change. So one of the things that we know is that the things that you do, your actions and your behaviors will change your attitude. So I am not going to discuss cognitive dissonance in this video because you have an entire case study. And if we have additional questions after that case study, then I will let you ask those and we can clarify if we need to from that point. I do love this comic though, so I would recommend, if you are having any sort of inconsistency on what cognitive dissonance is, go ahead and pause, read the comic, and then move forward. So other ways our actions can affect our attitude is the foot in the door phenomenon. And so this is basically, if you agree to something small, that makes you more likely to agree to something bigger in the future. And so you basically say, well, I must have liked this a little bit to be able to agree to it. And so if I like this a little bit, I can agree to something bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's basically a step of little baby steps in the direction of a set of behaviors. And so the key here that a lot of students mistake, you do have to actually make that agreement. So the comic we're seeing here is an actual fail. But very often we have one small request like, hi, can I have tell the time? And now my behavior would be to stop, engage in that conversation a little bit, and then follow up with something else. And this can be done through numerous steps. And one of the most notorious examples, we'll talk about the Milgram experiment shortly. And that's another classic example. Make sure when we see Milgram, you're looking for the foot in the door effect there too. Of course, the opposite is always true. Again, a total failure in the comic we're seeing, but a clear attempt. So door in the face is where you ask a total extreme question, and you know this is going to be a no, but then that extreme failure might cause some anxiety in the person that's rejecting you. And so maybe if you come back with a slightly more reasonable request afterwards, then you're more likely to get an agreement from that next one. So this slide is kind of all the other things that you might see trying to persuade you a certain way, or try to manipulate your actions in a certain way also. So it's very common. You're going to see limited time offers, making you feel pressured to make a decision on this attitude change. You have to make this behavior happen now, or else you're going to miss out on something else. The other one I really wanted to spend some time addressing is this colorful, thou shalt not take without giving in return. Later on in this chapter, the textbook brings up the norm of reciprocity. And I do want to address that as a way of changing attitudes and behavior and persuasion also. So the norm of reciprocity is basically that if someone does something for me, I now feel a pressure to respond, to give something also. So if you do something nice for me, this creates this social expectation that I'm now going to do something nice for you. And so we can see this a lot in advertising and in various other ways people might try to persuade you to change your attitude towards things. One of the things that I find very, just a classic example of this, there is a charity organization called the March of Dimes, and they do children's health research over a certain set of disorders or medical problems. And I don't know specifically what those are off the top of my head. But what's always impressed me about the March of Dimes is they will literally mail a dime. And so they send this information to a household, and I've received this a few times, and they send this information, and attached to it is a literal dime, actual United States currency. You can go out and spend your 10 cents. And their request is, hey, can you make a donation? Here's all the great things we're doing. Can you please make a donation to us? And so by sending you money first, that creates this just dissonance within us. And now there's that pressure. They already sent me money and they're doing all these great things. Maybe I should send them some money also. And so that's that norm of reciprocity and how we can see that. And that's a very extreme example. But if you see someone doing something for someone else and then asking for something in return, very often that can be the reciprocity norm. Or even if someone does something nice for you and doesn't expect anything in return, but yet you feel that pressure, you feel like you should be doing something in return for it also. The last concept we're going to address in this video is the importance of roles in your attitude. A lot of times when you're engaging in something new for you, it doesn't quite feel like you know what to do yet. And so the more you take on a certain role, in this case, our young CEO who's trying to run his business out of a bedroom in a cardboard box, the more he plays CEO, the more his attitudes and his actions will correspond to the actions and attitudes of a CEO. And so we see as people get into certain roles, these roles really start to influence their attitudes. And again, we will explore this a lot more as we continue to work through this unit also. So hopefully by this point, you feel much more comfortable with the first two A words of attribution and attitude. You should be able to talk about what are these two words. You should be able to talk about what makes attribution and attitude happen. And what are the mistakes that we make? In the case of attitude, how can that be influenced and changed over time? As always, I want the best for you also. If there's anything I can do to make you understand these more effectively or help you out in any way, please reach out. I'm happy to do so.